We're talking about the mini budget. It happened yesterday. Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan released that. Why do we have this mini budget? Can't they get it right the first time around?
Well, I think it's really a health check. And what some of the information in the mini budget shows is that they were actually very accurate. Because one of the main things they look at is how much money is going to come in from the tax source, which is our biggest source, by far our biggest source of revenue of public funds. And actually the figures are spot on, with the one exception, which is VAT, and there's a specific reason for that. So it's just to check that things haven't gone pear-shaped, alert us to possible problems in the last 6 months of the year, and just see how sensible the predictions were that were made during the main budget speech.
Okay, so before we get into various aspects of it, which I would like to ask a few questions about, are you're happy with where we are? SAPTY Limited, you're happy with where it is?
Well, I think SAPTY Limited is part of a global economy, and the global economy is a scary place to be right now. And I think that's the big thing, the big sort of bear that we all hoping won't come lurching out of the forest and eat us up, because we also are a relatively small economy by world standards. So I think we're doing pretty well given the environment. We have challenges. We have challenges in terms of growing our economy, creating jobs, containing spending, but by the same token achieving spending, because sometimes there's underspending because people don't have the capacity actually to do the necessary spending that has to happen.
Okay, I want to come back to the global impact a bit later, but there are a few areas that I'd like to cover in this conversation, and the one is the growth factor as opposed to the debt factor. Now, to me, as a man on the street, if I look at government's growth, that to me is the income stream, and debt is what goes out. The same as we do with our bank accounts. You earn so much, you spend so much. If I look at the number here, the economic growth forecast for 2011 is cut to 3.1%. The debt is projected to rise from just over 1 trillion at the end of this fiscal to more than 1.5 trillion in 2014-15. Firstly, let's look at growth. I read somewhere, and I may be wrong, that employment, to start getting employment going, means growth has to be at around 7%. We're sitting at 3.1.
Yeah, there's no question that we should be shooting for bigger numbers than that. And in a way, we are a hybrid. I mean, just in terms of the growth figures, we're doing a lot better than the first world economies, but we're not doing as well as some of our African fellow African countries.
And other emerging markets.
Correct.
As well.
And I think that's partly because we are more developed than some of our other African countries. So we fall somewhere in between. And it is absolutely essential for us to try and grow as quickly as possible.
How are we going to get that growth number up?
I think the biggest single thing is skills creation. I mean, we have a paradox of very many unemployed people in this country at the same time as having, the last estimate I heard was 1 million unfilled jobs. So we have 1 million jobs just sitting there waiting for someone to come and do them, but we don't have the skilled people to do them. At the same time, we have all these people, millions of people, without jobs. So that's the biggest thing we can do, is try and hang on to the skills we've got and upskill the rest of our population.
You see, that seems to be the problem to me in this whole equation, is that everything is so interlinked in it. Because I wanted to come back to job creation and the situation under spending with the deal that's been done with the Textile Workers Association, for example, where they've allowed the income, I'm getting lost here.
They've allowed the minimum
wage
to be cut for new entrants.
Shouldn't we, from an employment point of view and a growth point of view, be looking at that? Be looking at that across all industries?
Yes, I mean, I think we should be trying to, our laws quite rightly focus on employees and on their rights and on protecting them, and that has to happen. But I think our most compelling need at this point is to create new jobs. So possibly we do need to think about whether we aren't too protective of people who are in employment. And I mean, there's an indication from the Minister in relation to the public sector and wage demands, and saying that he's budgeting for much lower wage increases last year because, it's gone, the percentage, the cost to us of employing people in the public sector has just been ballooning. So we have to try to somehow create more jobs. And of course, I've mentioned the one key element, which is skills. The other one is inbound investment. We need investment, and not just portfolio investment, but fixed investment. We need people to come in and establish preferably labour-intensive industries.
What's the difference between portfolio and fixed investment?
Portfolio investment is essentially money flowing in on a temporary basis, investing in the JSE, which they can take out, or investing in the rand, which they can take out. So it doesn't represent actual fixed investment with machinery or buildings or employment. And of course that's good. We want the first form of investment as well. But the key one to creating long-term growth is fixed investment. We want people to come in and invest in our economy.
One of the things that the Minister said, and he made quite a point about it, was the whole argument about nationalisation and how difficult that is, or has made it for foreign investors to start looking at South Africa. I know this is not a political show, but do we need to start maybe clamping down on that sort of talk, because it's not helping those foreign investors?
I think there are two aspects to this discussion. The one is that I think people often get diverted by lunatic fringes who say things. They don't necessarily devote as much attention to what is mainstream ANC policy. And I believe what we saw from the Finance Minister yesterday represents mainstream ANC policy. So I do think that we need to realize that the ANC works in a certain way. There are lots of people who say lots of things. There's some sensible people who perhaps make less noise than other people. I do think that if we're looking to what is ANC policy, we should be looking at the Finance Minister, especially in relation to financial matters, which doesn't mean that the debate around nationalisation isn't going to happen, but I don't believe one should view that as ANC policy. It isn't. I do think it is harmful. I mean, I actually socially knew someone who was temporarily in South Africa and has left. He was heading up a major foreign-based mining company. They have all their operations through Africa. They had their management head office in South Africa, but they were not looking to make any investments in the mining sector in South Africa. And he specifically said it was because of the fears around nationalisation. So it does scare off investors.
Let's look at the other aspect of this now. We've done the growth side. Let's look at the debt side. As I said earlier, the debt to rise from 1 trillion to 1.5 trillion in the next 3 years. The Minister also mentioned in that 3-year budget policy plan that debt service costs are the fastest growing spending category, and that they will rise by over 14% this year and for the next 3 years. Now, if I'm looking at my bank balance, and I know that my debt costs are going to be rising by 14% over the next 3 years, would I be borrowing more money? My answer is no.
I think you have to consider what you're borrowing the money for. And in the case of an individual, if you were, for example, borrowing money in order to buy equipment, in order to make money, that might be a sensible reason to do so. And that's the kind of debt that we are looking at. I mean, the Minister's made it very clear that this increase in debt is for investment in our infrastructure. It's not there to fund running costs. It's when you start funding running costs like wasteful expenditure. I mean, the Auditor General came out last week with a statement that there was 26 billion rands of wasteful expenditure in I think the last financial year, up from 22 billion the year before. So that's the kind of thing that we have to address, and that was a very big theme of Minister Gordon's speech yesterday, was to say that we need to hold people accountable, especially local authorities, for the spending. So that debt is specifically targeted at improving our infrastructure, and the idea is that we'll be well positioned when the world economy turns around to then make money, to claw the money back. The other key thing is that we are in a position to do this because of prudent fiscal management in the past, because of saving money, which was done mainly under Minister Manuel. That's enabled us to keep our debt ratio at a fairly modest level by world standards. And we are going to climb up to about 40% of GDP, which is fairly acceptable by world standards. But it is assuming that we're going to invest this money wisely, and that when the world economy turns around, we'll be well positioned to take advantage of that.
Industrial zones that are being planned, that was also one of the things that came up. The whole plan down in Port Elizabeth seems to be gaining a bit of traction at this stage. Where else would they be looking at?
Well, I think one of the areas, interesting, I'm not an expert on industrial zones, but I was in the East Rand recently, and I saw that they were, the Ekurhuleni municipality was punting the East Rand as a sort of a hub for logistics, because you're close to the airport and close to lots of industrial areas. So I think in planning where to put these things, you have to consider a number of factors, one of which is to try and improve that area if you can, but that's not going to be enough. It has to be a viable option in terms of the basic way the country works. One of our biggest problems, I was on a show last night with someone who used to be with Richards Bay Coal Terminal, and he was saying one of the biggest issues is our rail infrastructure. So we need our railways to make, because we're a very large country with a relatively small and scattered population. So in planning industrial development zones, we need to take into account long-term development. Will we be able to, if we, for example, produce goods, get those goods to ports or airports? And we have to look at the whole picture. What is the impact going to be of toll roads? Toll roads in Gauteng has the potential to greatly increase operating costs in Gauteng. So what effect will that have on industrial development zones in Gauteng?
The whole thing about spending and government expenditure is something I'd like to touch on in just a moment, because the Minister did say that the budget framework provides for a 5% annual cost of living adjustment for public sector employees. They have been looking at initial demands of 18% at times. The presidency budget was increased by 115 million rand to cover, amongst other things, and I quote, higher than expected salary increases. Can government contain public spending? That's the question that we're going to put to our guest just after the break. We'll be back with you in just a moment.